Hello, my name is Mayellen Taylor, and I'm going to be talking today for a few minutes about Putin's war in Ukraine that started in February of 2022, and how he used narratives about World War II to justify the invasion of the Ukraine and some of the violence that's happened as a result of his virulent rhetoric about the people in Ukraine. So, there's a history in what was the Soviet Union and Russia of changing the narratives of history to meet the needs of the leaders and to push their political agendas. And that started with Stalin after World War II. World War II was called the Great Patriotic War in Russia, and Stalin used that war to elevate himself and to push the narrative of the strength of the Soviet Union and of sacrifice and of the permanence of the state but the transient of the individual, to further the Soviet Union into the Cold War and deal with the consequences of the war. Now, Russia was left pretty decimated in a similar way as Germany and Japan, and the West expected Russia to rise from the ashes rather quickly, and that just wasn't what happened. But Stalin, with this development, with his historical narratives, sets a precedent that's going to follow even after he dies into the following leaderships, and the narrative is going to shift and change until it's Putin's turn, and he returns to something of a Stalinist viewpoint in terms of the value of the war and the nature of supporting the state, elevating the state above the individual. And that's what we see in this rhetoric about Ukraine. So, in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych is elected in Ukraine as president. He is Putin's man. He is pro-Russian, and there's an economic agreement, and the parliament and the people wanted to have an economic agreement with the European Union, and that was approved by the legislative branch. And when it came time to decide, Yanukovych went with a Russian-backed economic agreement, and that angered the population and led to massive demonstrations across Ukraine, with which he responded in a way that only exacerbated those protests and just ensured his loss of power, as there were violent clashes with police and snipers shooting protesters, and over 100 people were shot in those. So that only degraded his role in the public specter. And this sort of degeneration of Ukraine gives Putin an in to make excuses to seize Crimea. So the protests evolve across Ukraine to remove Yanukovych and return to an earlier version of the Constitution. There's massive violence, and Putin grasps this idea to state that there are neo-Nazis running the government of Ukraine, and that Jewish Ukrainians are facing genocide and abuse. And it turns out that some of the violence that was perpetrated was actually Russian doings in order to prove that there was a need to defend the Jews of Ukraine, and that the propaganda was painted by Russians, often painted backwards or wrong, which, was a little bit confusing. So this spurs him to make the excuse to seize Crimea and defeat the Nazis that had taken over the government. Now, there is, or there was, a white nationalist, anti-Semitic faction in the government. They have a multi-party system, and a small percentage of these white nationalists have been elected to office. But a lot of that was more about a reaction to Yanukovych than it was to being anti-Semitic. Jewish people in Ukraine didn't necessarily feel targeted. There were some instances of violence, but not to the extent that Putin claimed that there were. Like, people weren't fleeing Ukraine to escape anti-Semitism. People fled Ukraine to flee from the Russian attacks. So that's where the real violence was. So what we see is just before the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Putin signed a memory law. These are laws that are intended to limit speech in that they curtail what can be said or published about a country's experiences with World War II. Now, Russia is not the only country to have these laws. Poland passed one recently. But it's to control the narrative of what happened. And so in 2014, the law was passed, no repatriating Nazis, and no, stating that the Russians or the Soviets had been in the wrong. Now, in 2021, a larger scale law was passed that outlawed speaking against Russians. And a lot of this was in reaction to the former Soviet sphere. All these Eastern European countries who'd been under Soviet control have been forced to follow that Soviet narrative. And as they, broke away from communism and developed democracies, then these countries developed their own collective memories. And a lot of times that implicated the Russians for the extreme violence. You think of like the Ukrainian famine in the 30s that killed so many people, and Putin did not appreciate or like that these memorials and these public statements were being made that incriminated Russia. So, with the taking of Crimea or Ukraine, if that happens, those laws come into place there as well. So he wants to control the narrative across the former Soviet sphere. The 2021 law was amended to add jail time and fines. And I actually read a story, I can't remember where I read it, but it was a couple weeks ago, about a teenager who had reposted something on the Russian version of Facebook about Russia's role in the war. And then he was tried and charged $200,000 for his spreading falsehoods. And the Russian security system was so quick, only 20 people saw his post, and one of the 20 people that saw it was the observing agency. So that's pretty interesting. What we see Putin doing is using propaganda in his speeches in the cities. He's trying to garner public support for his wars. He's trying to convince the Russian people that this war is so important. It follows in the footsteps of the Great Patriotic War. We have to get rid of the Nazis. The Nazis are back. And he calls Ukrainians Hitlerites and Hitler's accomplices. And then he says things about the United States being complicit with Nazis and supporting Nazis. And I'll grant you that our civil rights history does not lend itself to oppose that very well, unfortunately. But that's what he's doing. And then the Kremlin outlet, the Russia Today, RT, has quite a media presence on social media. And basically everyone is a Nazi to RT. Americans are Nazis. Everybody that serves in the military in Ukraine is a Nazi. Everyone's elevating Nazis. And it's the Russians' job to protect not only the Jews in Ukraine, but also the Russians themselves from Nazi invasion, right? Because that's what comes next. So in 2014, Russia seizes Crimea. It has a lot of ethnically Russian people in Crimea, many with Russian leanings or Russophiles. And you can see here in the picture, like, all the soldiers have no identifying material on their uniforms. We called them the Little Green Men. And they, Putin at the time was swearing they weren't his men, they weren't Russians. And I remember when it was going on, one of them posted his jogging route or something like that on the internet, and it was kind of all found out. But basically, the West sort of followed that policy of appeasement. We know how that goes, and allowed Russia to claim Crimea. Now, there have been some human rights issues in Crimea beyond the anti-Semitic violence that was in place before the attack perpetrated by the Russians. But most of the human rights violations in Crimea were surrounding the shutdown of not First Amendment in Ukraine, but freedom of speech and the ability to have a free press. And then the issue of citizenship. Russia was making the people, the Ukrainians in Crimea, reapply for citizenship and declare their loyalty to Russia and things like that, which are not necessarily on the up and up. The invasion in February of 2022 is significantly more violent. It was widespread across many cities, extremely violent, civilian deaths. Recorded deaths that we have so far is 8,500, give or take, but again, these numbers aren't solid, and it's going to take, the end of violence and the ability to go through mass graves and talk to families and see what's happened, talk to funeral homes, all those kind of things, and get the details for the total numbers. I'll talk more specifically about the human rights violations in a moment, but there is a massive refugee crisis. I think it's 10 million have fled Ukraine to go to just Poland alone. And I just read a headline that said the refugee crisis had eclipsed the Syrian refugee crisis, which was the largest since the Holocaust. So that's pretty dramatic. And this is, a situation that's unfolding. So we talked already about what was going on in Crimea, but in Ukraine we are seeing vastly different types of human rights violations: massive rape, violence, torture, detention, unjustified detention, execution, mass killings. It's really grotesque. It's reminiscent of World War II to hear of these crimes, of what's happening to people. And again, the stories fully won't come out until after the war, and that's something to dread. In Bucha, there was, in March of 2022, earliest the first couple days of March, there was a planned attack where the Russians came in with lists of names, and they were killing specific people. They were torturing. They were tying them up, execution style. As people were trying to flee the city, they would just shoot everyone in the car. Again, the numbers are not clear. Initial numbers were around 250. Some numbers are as high as 500. They have to clear mass graves. There were people in the streets. It was pure chaos, and just extreme violence. And there's indication that this happened in many cities across Ukraine, with the lists and developed by the intelligence agencies to clear out specific members of the population. So here we are a year later, and what has happened? Well, public opinion has shifted. A lot of Ukrainians are hell-bent on winning. Russians who seem to be reluctant to be public about how they feel. There have been massive protests across Russia, and those have been met with Russian violence from the authorities. The AP and in conjunction with PBS and the news show Frontline, have been trying to keep track of possible human rights violations across Ukraine in the last year, and they identified 653 possible crimes against humanity, that those have to be further investigated. so we won't know. So the concern is defending Ukraine. What happens when, if Putin takes Ukraine? Is he moving to another nation? What is the plan? Many of the allies have been supplying weapons, supplying money, supplying technical support to Ukraine, but it's not enough to defeat Russia. We don't want a proxy war, but is that what this is? It's hard to say. We're at a critical point. I think a lot of people in the West are surprised by Russia's disorganization and failures in the war and what they assumed was going to be easy. So it's important that we keep a watch on what's happening.